let me start introducing the members of the panel. Start from my left and move across the stage. This is Dolores Acevedo Garcia from Brandeis University. She's the Samuel F. and Rose B. Gingold Professor of Human Development and Social Policy. She's also the Director of the Institute of Child, Youth, and Family Services at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. Next to him is, what's that guy's name? Oh, Smeeding, that's right.
High essence.
Dr. Tim Smeeding, who's the Lee Rainwater Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Economics at the Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Next to him is Michael Strain, who's our beloved conservative representative who comes to every Brookings event so we can have one conservative.
We're 2 doors down. The pastries are good here.
Yeah.
Lunch is better there.
Michael is a John G. Searle Scholar and Director of Economic Policy Studies of the American Enterprise Institute, and that's still Greg Duncan over there, I think. I don't think he's changed yet.
Still is.
Yeah, so he gets to be a member of the panel. We're going to try to keep him from dominating the discussion. So each of the panel members is going to talk for 5 minutes. They've selected some issue that they think is important from the report, and we'll listen to that. And then I'm going to ask them some questions. They may question each other a little bit, and then we'll give the audience a chance to ask questions. So Dolores, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, and good morning. I'm going to talk about 2 very important aspects of the report and of child poverty in the U.S. One of them is the existence of very wide disparities in poverty by race and ethnicity and also by other demographic factors. And as Greg mentioned, I'm also going to talk about the importance of contextual factors in child poverty. And those 2 things are related, so I'm going to use my 5 minutes to try to explain how they are related. First of all, as Greg reviewed, we have a lot of evidence that the experience of poverty has harmful consequences across the life course for any child that experiences child poverty. Those can be pretty devastating effects. But we also know that not all children are equally likely to grow up in poverty. And particularly in the U.S., Hispanic and Black children have much higher poverty rates. Hispanic children have the highest poverty rate at the moment. About 22% of Hispanic children are growing up in poverty, and that rate is about 3 times higher the rate of non-Hispanic white children. The U.S. has experienced a very dramatic change in the composition of the child population in terms of increasing diversity, and that coupled with higher poverty rates for Hispanic and Black children has resulted in a pretty dramatic change in the composition of children that live in poverty. Today, the largest group of children in poverty are Hispanic children. They represent about 41% of the population of children in poverty, up from 12% in 1970. White children represent about 31%, down from 55% in 1970. Because of these very wide differences, the committee felt very strongly that we needed to examine programs and packages not only in terms of the overall poverty-reducing effects, but also effects by subgroup, including race, ethnicity, immigrant status, and other demographic variables. I encourage you to look at the report and appendices because it's a very rich picture of the different differential effects that we examined, and it's very important to pay attention to those to give you a sense of some of the general findings. The good news is that programs packages 3 and 4 not only achieve overall reduction of poverty of about 50%, but also we have very significant effects for many subgroups, and the effects are even larger for African American children. The flip side of that is that some subgroups of children, for example, non-citizen children, benefit very little even with packages 3 and 4. So the committee also recognized that we have a number of contextual factors that although we couldn't include in the simulations, we felt, because of the evidence, that it was very important to discuss how, one, they exacerbate the experience of child poverty for children in poverty, and they can also limit the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs. We examined Chapter 8, 6 of these factors very thoroughly, and I encourage you to read Chapter 8, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them just very briefly now. So first of all, we look at a lot of factors that disproportionately affect minority children. who, as I said, already have very high poverty rates. So we look at factors such as discrimination in employment. As you know, many programs require that beneficiaries work. So discrimination in employment, which continues today, makes it harder for minority families, first of all, to be employed, and second, to benefit from these programs. Housing discrimination can also limit the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs and involvement in the criminal justice system as well. And then we also look at neighborhood conditions. There is significant evidence that neighborhood conditions affect long-term outcomes, and also that they may interact with the effectiveness of anti-poverty programs. And we know that poor minority children are much more likely than poor white children to live in poor neighborhood conditions. So I only have about a minute left, so I don't want to leave you with the impression that we have these horrible inequities and these contextual factors that we don't have evidence on. We do. But first of all, as Greg said, we are academics, so we recommend that more research on all of these factors and how they interact with programs. But we also encourage you to read the report and read about some of the ways in which we think that even today, the design and implementation of programs can try to pay attention to some of these contextual factors, and thus try to benefit minority children, especially minority children who experience some of these factors disproportionately. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Tim?
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here. We had a great group, and we worked really hard on this, and we hope you appreciate our efforts. I want to talk a little bit more about the packages and sort of what went into them and why. As you saw, we could just spend enough money to blow kids out of poverty, but we didn't want to do that. That is not the right thing to do in our mind. On the other hand, what if you want to help people work more, get more from work, make sure that work is rewarded, it covers their families, and that they can have decent child care assistance. So all of our packages, which is what I'm going to talk about, all have work components in it, every one of them. We think work is important. We think that people, if they're given the opportunity at a reasonable wage, with the earned income credit behind them, and decent child care for their kids, that work will increase. And in fact, all the simulations showed that. On the other hand, work alone isn't enough. We saw that in the first package. So you need something else. You need some sort of support. In general, we argue that, poor families have multiple needs. And some need work support, as I said. Some may need housing or food. Some just need a little bit of cash assistance to stabilize their incomes and to help them get through really rough months. Okay. So we put those packages together in that way. And when we got done with it, we saw that the first package, as Greg pointed out, work is important, but work advance with the other work supports is not alone enough by itself. It would bring 1 million more workers into the economy, but it only reduces poverty by 20%. Now we had 2 big packages which got us there. And to get us there, it's not cheap, okay? So either we had to expand the SNAP program and the public housing program enough to bring people out of poverty, or we had to do something with the child tax credit that would expand the benefit to virtually all children. And that's the idea of the child allowance, which essentially takes the child tax credit that we all get and makes it one version and makes it fully refundable to the bottom third of kids who don't get it, okay? The idea here is that if you looked at the one package, that it got us 35% reduction and we spent $44 billion. Of that $44 billion, $30 billion is spent taking the $2,000 per child credit that we all get up to $400,000 a year and just extending it down to the bottom so that everyone gets it. And paying it monthly through the Social Security Administration. Okay? That's how it would be done, all right? The program that was really expensive, the 100 and some billion one, 80 billion of that went for the child allowance. Why? Because it was had to be 2,700 to get it there. 2,400 got us a 48% reduction, so then we had to go to 2,700. Why is it so much more expensive? Because every kid in the country gets the extra 400 or the extra 700. So in other words, all the kids who are getting the $2,000 child tax credit now would have to go up to 400 or 700, okay? But the main thing behind this is that it's delivered through the tax system, The tax system assesses who the parent is, looks at the child's social security number. You've got a pairing and transfers that to the Social Security Administration if the family would like it to be paid monthly, and they start paying it out monthly. This is also important if you think, how are we going to have a child care tax credit for low-income families that every month they're supposed to come up with $500 or $400 or $500 a month to pay their part of decent child care, and then wait till the end of next year to get the refundability? That won't work. It's got to be done monthly as well. The Social Security Administration could do it that way too. But the idea is that this is if you think of $2,000, that's $170 a month, essentially, okay? That's not a lot of money. We're not blowing people out. We're helping them get out of deep poverty. But there's families reported again and again, they're willing to trade stability in their incomes for more income. They would like something that they just rely on every month. If the rest of us would like to take it annually, we can just stay just where we are. But if you wanted it monthly, it could be delivered that way. So that's the main idea. And so the package idea is to pull a bunch of things together that will both increase work and stabilize family incomes. And so that's where the packages came from. And I'd be happy to answer any other questions you had after. Thank you.
Thanks. Michael?
That was very impressive.
Yeah. So far, 2 right on time.
That's right, I saw that.
Yeah, let's keep the record going.
I'm not going to do that probably. Thank you, Ron, for having me. Thank you all for being here. Ron suggested that I represent or discuss some of the conservative scholars and analysts' response to the report, which I think is a good idea. We, of course, are in favor of child poverty, and so the entire thrust of the report we think is off base. They laughed, so they knew it was a joke, so that's good. More seriously, I think that there is a lot in this report for people who approach these issues from the center right to like. And I think that, in general, the report is a wonderful resource and very well done, and something that will inform the policy community and hopefully policymakers for years and years to come. Some things that really jumped off the page to me: the report used the supplemental poverty measure and not the official poverty measure, and didn't make any bones about that. That I think is very important. It explicitly recognizes the policies that we're talking about and the effect those policies have, which is something that center right analysts have been frustrated by for years and years and years, and this report reflects that. The report argues that the decline of the two-parent family structure is the biggest factor that was associated with the increase in official child poverty from the mid-'70s to the early 1990s. That is an important argument. I think that is also analytically correct, that family structure matters, and that the environment in which children are raised matters. And the report is very direct in arguing that the more recent declines in child poverty have primarily been due to increases in maternal employment. So like Tim said, like Greg said, employment is a really important part of this story. And the report, I think, does emphasize the importance of work. Like Tim said, we could solve child poverty tomorrow if we just gave every poor family enough money to not be in poverty anymore. And that's not what the report did. And so I think that is an important part of the report. It's something that people on the center right should like, and I think it's objectively the right way to approach these issues as well. There are some things that I think that I personally was a little troubled by, and that I think many people on the center right were troubled by as well. One is, I think, pushing harder on this notion of how do we define poverty. The SPM is better than the official poverty measure. Should we be looking at measures like consumption poverty? Should we be looking at different ways of measuring poverty? I think that's an important conversation for the research community and the policy community to have. I think the kind of broader criticism, I think, is less of a criticism of the report and more of a caution not to use the report exclusively in informing policy. The report, as Greg's presentation made clear, had a very high evidentiary standard for what could be included in the simulations. That's perfectly appropriate for a report like this, perfectly appropriate for a National Academies report. But it is the case that there are some policies and some kind of features of social and economic life that are more amenable to the tools of causal inference, but that there are also many important features of social and economic life that, even though they're not amenable to those tools, are nonetheless important. So when people on the center right think about what happened in the mid 1990s, and if you look at the graph in the report, you see, child poverty kind of puttering along, and then in the early 1990s, you see this dramatic drop where it almost did drop in half. I think it was something like 27% to 15% or something like that. The way that a lot of people on the center right think about that, and the way that I think about that, is that there was a combination of things that happened. There were changes in the programs, time limits, work requirements. There were more generous work supports and expanded earned income tax credit. But importantly, there was public messaging. There was a change in social expectations. There was the reality that public leaders, the President of the United States, the Congress, governors, and opinion leaders were saying, we expect you to work. Work is now an expectation, and that is included in the structure of these programs. But beyond just tweaks to the structure of the programs, this is the new way we're approaching these things. It's hard to do a randomized evaluation of the importance of public messaging. It's hard to do a randomized evaluation of the importance of these sorts of cultural changes. That doesn't mean that they don't matter. So this report, I think, is best seen as a complement, as one part of a way to inform policy, rather than as the whole story. Like I said, the report couldn't include that change in ethos, because you can't do an RCT to study that. But it was likely a very important part of the picture. I went a little
You went over.
I went a little over.
Yep, there will be a penalty. We'll talk about it later. Okay, I want to begin where you ended.
You want me to go over longer?
No, definitely not. And also a major part of Greg's presentation, a major part of the report, and from my perspective as a member of the committee, to me the most fascinating part of the report were the packages. Let me first make the point that the report does not make any recommendations about policy. That's a National Academy principle, right? We don't say, do this policy. We gave examples of policies that would do what we were asked to do, and the Congress decides. Now let me raise a question about the two reforms, policies that would meet the criteria of the report of 50% should not necessarily be the ones that get all our focus. And this has been hinted by previous speakers, but the work-oriented package, which consists of the earned income tax credit, child tax credit, increase in minimum wage, and a new program called Work Advance, all focused on work. It would reduce poverty by only 20%. But it would cost only $8.7 billion compared to $90 billion and $100 billion for the two packages that reduce poverty. And this is beyond belief to me, it increases employment by 1 million people. So, to my moderate right of center view, that's a better package. And it's more practical, and we might be able to get it through the Congress. What do you think of that, panel?
I like all that.
I don't.
Okay, why not, Tim?
Work alone is not enough. That's just it. What you're buying for the $8.7 billion is an extra million people who are working. I agree, and poverty may fall by 19%. Doesn't do a lot for deep poverty either. It doesn't get you where you want to go. Work alone is not enough. Increased support for work gets you 600,000, 588,000 in the smaller package, which is the one I like if you want to talk about what you like. For $44 billion, that gets us a 35% reduction. And it just extends the same level of support that most parents get for their kids to the kids at the bottom with the CTC. Plus, it enhances work through a little bit better earned income tax credit and a child care tax credit. To me, that's the sweet spot for me, because it covers all of our needs, and it does a good job, and I think about 40% reduction in deep poverty too. It doesn't get us all the way there, but it's a really good start. Now, if somebody in Congress decides that the child tax credit should be $2,500 a kid or $3,000 a kid, then the cost of the child, covering the bottom third who don't get it, is another $5-10 billion. So that, again, so the big money is when you try and make a child allowance that's higher than the child tax credit we have now. But just taking what we've got now, extending that to everybody, so there's a floor, there's something there, there's some stability. That seems to work for me. And it's not like poor families aren't working. Most of them are. Most of the poor parents are, those who can get it together. There's a lot of complex situations, as you know, and stuff going on out there with people that makes it hard. But we think that I'd rather, if my trade-offs would be, I'd take 600,000 more working, spend $40 billion and reduce child poverty by a third, and especially do a good job in deep poverty. That's what I would pick. That's me. Again, we don't pick packages, but we can look. We've been decommissioned. We can speak for ourselves now, as well as speaking for
There were several earlier occasions when you were just about decommissioned, but you escaped all those. So, okay, related to this, Greg threw in at the end, and it's covered in the report, but it's not the report does not go into any detail, that we lose annually about $800 billion to $1.1 trillion through various things that happen in American life that cost a lot of money and that poor people are engaged in. So this would be lost productivity, increased crime, increased health spending, and so forth. That number is not examined too carefully, and I don't think that we have anything in the report, correct me if I'm wrong, that shows that if we have this policy, then it will reduce that spending. Members of the panel, why do you think or don't think that our spending and our recommendations would eat into that possibly $1.1 trillion that is now spent? That alone would be a justification for the recommendations if it works out the way we implied in the report. Greg, you want to say something?
Sure. So it kind of relates to the previous question also, right? I think package one is, if it's package one versus nothing, I think it's a clear gain, but it's only a 20% reduction in poverty, and it ignores the fact that there are these potential costs of child poverty. That literature is, it's not estimating these 800 billion, 1.1 trillion. They're not super strong experimental studies or quasi-experimental studies, so we didn't emphasize them in the report. But if you think about what we did in the third chapter, right, where we reviewed the causal impact of poverty on kids, they weren't long-term, well, a couple of were long-term studies, right, but most of them were shorter-term studies. So we know when we rolled out public health insurance programs that there were positive impacts on birth weight, on child health, the kinds of things that you might expect over the years to accumulate into more adult productivity and better health and things like that. When we rolled out, there's a very strong study on the rollout of the food stamp program, right, which was county by county in the United States, 60s and 70s. So you could look and see to what extent kids who were born into counties, right, that either were going to get food stamps at age 5 or were already getting food stamps. You could look later, 20 years later, 30 years later, at whether the timing of food stamp introduction in the county of residence had any relationship to adult health, adult employment. And what you found was this incredible, with respect to health, it was a measure of cardiovascular health, that kids who were born into, low-income kids born into counties with food stamps ended up with substantially lower risk, cardiovascular risk, when they were in their 30s and 40s than kids born into counties where food stamps didn't start till age 5 or so. So the kinds of enhancements that we're considering, right, enhancements to food stamps, child allowance, and so forth, seem to have these short-term impacts. That's what Chapter 3 was all about. And we just don't have enough evidence to really nail down is it 800 billion, is it 1.1 trillion? What is that number? But we're much more certain about the short-run improvements in child well-being from more generous levels of these programs.
I have no doubt that there are social costs to child poverty, and the estimates in the report I think are ballpark reasonable. Like Greg said, I think it's hard to pin a specific number on them. I think that when this is outside the scope of the report, but it's very important in the policy debate. When thinking about the costs of these sorts of packages, it is reasonable to think about, okay, well, we'll have less crime and we'll have more people working, and so there'll be these social costs. But the logic that the program will pay for itself, I think, can be taken too far for two reasons. One, it may be that a study of food stamps in the 60s showed that in the 90s, the kids who got the food stamps in the 60s were better off. That we need to be pretty careful about making statements that if we were to give a whole bunch of extra food stamps to kids in the year 2020, that we know what will happen to their health in 2050 based on those estimates. I mean, that's just a very hard thing for social science to predict. But secondly, budget costs matter. Budget costs are an important part of the policy debate, and they matter. And again, this is outside the scope of the report, but a lot of the good things that are in the report would be a lot more politically feasible if there were more budget space for them. And so I think the policy debate, I think, should take more seriously these sorts of intergenerational trade-offs. Tim is very concerned, I think correctly, about deep poverty, concerned about what a heavy emphasis on work-based solutions to child poverty would do to people who are in deep poverty who aren't feasibly going to end up working. I'm concerned about that too. Tim wants to do some sort of a child allowance for those kids in deep poverty. I think that's a reasonable solution to try and push them up. It would be a lot more reasonable if instead of borrowing that money from abroad, we could take some of the money we're spending on middle-class seniors and spend it on those kids. And I think thinking about these packages in that more holistic way, more as a priority setting exercise and less as more money will help exercise, actually could at least in the policy community increase the amount of traction they get.
Why sock it to the elderly? Just get rid of the carried interest provision, which everyone has said they were going to do forever.
Or the money we spend on rich people would also be a good place to take that.
I mean, this is
A lot of the elderly are pretty well off.
the thing about putting things in tax programs and taxes. Aaron Ladowski said this a long time ago. It's where social programs go to hide. He was mainly talking about tax expenditures
Sure.
and benefits we get. But still, it's the same thing. $44 billion, it's part of an increased EITC, $8 billion in there for the child tax credit and extending the current child credit down. That $44 billion, that's a blip. That's in the error term when we start talking about tax policy. And that's where I think, but if you want, to pay for it, we could find ways to pay for it. Now, you did not hear here that Mike wants to axe the elderly, please, because those votes are the votes that old guys like me is exactly who his center-right people need. I am more center for sure, but we can come up with that money. And I do realize budgetary costs. That's why the idea of just blowing people out of poverty with more money is not it. But just some sort of a reasonable balance between a minimal level of support and emphasis on work. I do believe that the long-term solution is a good job. I believe, as you do, I know that the current economy. We're going to do a project together to figure out what this really has done for low-income people. Is really a boon. People's wages are finally rising at the bottom. More people are engaged in work, and so forth. So I'm optimistic, but it's not going to be free. That's just the way it is.
Any other comments on this? Okay, I want to raise two other issues that we dealt with in the report. We've dealt with them a little bit here, but not a lot, and that is marriage and fertility control, both of which have data. I mean, we present it quickly here, but there are studies that show that, first of all, marriage, if we could increase marriage rates, it would definitely have a big impact on poverty. I don't think there's hardly anybody denies that anymore. It used to be a very controversial thing, but a lot of people agree if we could increase marriage rates without changing anything else, if you randomly assign low-income families to marriages, it would reduce the poverty rates.
Historically, that's happened.
What, are your ideas that marriages are random? Anyway, so we'll call that the strange solution, randomly assigned.
Your wife is quite in favor of being reassigned.
Yeah, she wants to reassign. Yes. She has told me that often, most recently last night. So we could have a big impact, but it is true, as the report concludes, I think, and some people in this audience I know a lot about this, that we don't have very good evidence that the things that we've tried to do increase marriage have worked very well. There are always some new program that someone shows is going to double marriage rates, but so far nothing like that has worked out on a broad scale. So we haven't been able to do it, but I'm just bringing this up that it's a very encouraging thing that we ought to try to figure it out. And the same thing, not the same thing, but something similar concerns the attempt to control fertility. If we could control fertility and people got to actually make choices and only wanted babies that the mother said she wanted, or the mother and the father in that case, if they're married or are a couple, that would have a big impact on the number of poor babies that are born, and that would in turn have a big impact on poverty. And that literature, I think, it's not like the marriage literature in the sense that it's forget it, we can't do it, because we have a lot of examples of ability to control births in accord with what mothers want. We have programs that are statewide that have shown that. We have much better technology now. We have new approaches in clinics that do everything in one day if the mother chooses to control her fertility. So I think I'm not saying we shouldn't have, but we shortchanged that a little bit. We could make some real progress, definitely on fertility and maybe on marriage. So what do you think of that, panel?
I don't think that we were shortchanging that. I think that we look at the evidence very carefully. And I think that in terms of marriage, of course, and also fertility, there is kind of a mechanical way in which if you address those issues, you would reduce poverty. But I think it's very important. That's why we also examine contextual factors very carefully to understand that people arrive at life decisions such as marriage and how many children they're going to have based on their social context. And there are many reasons why people may choose to be a single parent as opposed to a married parent that speak to structural issues in our society, including things that are very differential by race and make perfect sense from their perspective. So I'm going to do what Tim did about assigning now my own opinion instead of the committee's perspective.
You're
I think
decommissioned too, so it's fine.
I've been decommissioned, so that's great.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important that we do not think about these pipelines of things that happen along the life course, putting them aside from the context that people are experiencing. And so we spoke to those issues in the report. There are, of course, issues that are very serious, such as undertones of population control that is very racialized, that have been attached to particular ways of thinking about contraception. So no one is thinking about limiting access to women's health and reproductive health. I think the report is very clear that we think that there is evidence that those things are incredibly valuable for families. But I personally don't think that we should approach poverty reduction thinking primarily about those approaches.
We gave it our all with respect to the long-acting reversible contraceptive policies, which, as you say, have a lot of very promising evidence associated with them. Isabel Sawhill has worked in this area for a long time. We just couldn't get to the point where we were confident that it could be plugged into the simulation model, right? So we review the evidence. We say it's promising, but we just can't push it to the point where it was one of our 20 policy options. You know, with marriage, you've been involved in this. We really tried very hard with a number of different models. We did random assignment evaluations. You know, we evaluate and review that evidence too. It's just very, very hard to change marriage rates.
I'm not a big fan of the idea that we should be aggressively pushing long-acting reversible contraception, but I do believe that you're right in your emphasis on marriage. And my reading of the evidence is the same as Greg's, that the available evidence suggests that's a pretty tough nut to crack. I think that's another example of where public messaging and attempts to influence the culture around marriage really, really can matter. If, you know, more, I mean, you know, the people who are, marriage rates are very different for different groups of people. And if people at the top of the income distribution were more comfortable kind of preaching what they practice with respect to marriage and family life, I think that really could accrue to the benefit of lower income people. I mean, it's hard to argue with the mechanical effect that if you have two people in the household, you're going to have more income in a lot of cases, and that's going to help with poverty. The evidence on the benefits of stable parenting is much stronger than the evidence on the benefits of marriage. But in the United States, at least, the way you get stable parenting is by having people get married. You know, we don't have the same culture as France or other Western European countries about this. And so I think marriage needs to be a major part of these discussions, even if there's no, you know, it's very easy to turn the knob on the EITC or the child tax credit. It's much harder to turn the knob on marriage, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth effort and attention.
I would agree. I think that hopefully the Brookings Middle Class Initiative and more, you know, people who look like they're marriageable because they've developed good career and have good income leads to more marriages. On fertility, the good news that we're seeing right now, we don't understand why, is that fertility is actually dropping amongst lower, in particular, non-married women. That's been the experience in the last few years. We don't know exactly why. A little bit of it has to do with LARC and the rest, but the idea of postponing kids until you're ready is attractive to me because I think the kids are going to do better. All the evidence, Greg has just published a couple of papers on it, that older parents are more able, are more stable, are more ready to parent and so forth. I think that would be good, but the social engineering is, it's not what I do.
At least in your professional life.
Defer to my.
Okay, now, let the record show that Tim impinged on the audience's time, but we're going to move forth anyway. So in the audience, it's your turn to ask questions. We frown on long statements, especially if they're theoretical in nature. Ask a question about the report or something the panel has said, and let's proceed in that fashion. So who's first? Yes, right here. A person will come around and give you a microphone and then stand up and ask your question, please. Tell us your name and state the question.
Griffin Murphy, National Academy of Social Insurance. So the work package looks really promising, but if you tie something to work, it's going to be more volatile. So maybe what would the work package look like in a recession? Could lead to more volatile poverty rate and volatile household incomes. Thanks.
It's a good point.
Yeah, more stability.
We
more
learned
stability.
it the hard way.
It's a good point. Next question. In the back there. Get your hand down. You're not running this panel.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Sophia Warner. I was looking at the report and looking at constructually how you were deciding how you would go forward. And one of the issues, it doesn't seem that you pull yourself away from the options that exist already and ask, well, what is happening on the ground that's causing the poverty? So, for example, it mentions housing, and it says, hey, look, if we give these housing vouchers or we increase the programs, in fact, it doesn't really make a big difference. But study after study after study shows that for the bottom 50% of the population, we do not have enough housing for them. And the cost is way too high for them. They're going to spend more than 30% of their income. So the approach of stepping back and saying, hey, how do we actually build more housing? How do we incentivize the growth of affordable housing, but also fair market housing? So housing that if you are working, you should be able to afford to live and not spend more than 30%. Have you guys taken approaches like that? Because it doesn't sound like you have.
Panel.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I do think that we consider the Section 8 voucher very thoroughly and carefully, and we do show a significant effect of expanding the utilization of the voucher, which is, basically we want to serve more families with the voucher. That's the idea in the options that we consider. And it does have important effects. So I encourage you to read about that. I think that we were asked to consider policies and programs. So we, at the federal level, obviously there are other issues such as zoning at the local level that affect the price of housing, including the location of affordable housing and the price of affordable housing. That was not part of our task. But I also encourage you to read particularly Chapter 8, where we discuss the connection between the Section 8 voucher programs and this issue of housing availability, as well as where families are able to locate. So Section 8 voucher program, in addition to being a subsidy, it can also promote the location of families in neighborhoods with more opportunities for their kids. And although we did not simulate that in the models that we run, we actually considered those options and we discussed them. So I agree with you that housing and the problems with housing affordability are bigger than what we address in the report, but I think the treatment of the housing problem and the option of using Section 8 is very thoroughly addressed.
Can I? Oh,
Go, you
please,
go.
please.
You go.
So if I like your question very much, and if I were to take your question and put it into an economics 101 model, I think what you're saying correctly is that the price of housing is very high. That's bad for poor people. A big part of the reason why the price is high is because the supply is too low. And I would add that part of the reason the supply is too low are these sorts of zoning issues and other supply restrictions. That's also true for childcare. If we had more childcare suppliers, the price of childcare would be lower. Part of the reason we don't have more childcare suppliers is because of regulations. It's true for healthcare as well, for the provision of healthcare. It is true for occupational licensing and other policies that restrict entry into occupations that are keeping people out of those occupations and that are likely increasing the poverty rate as well. And so this is another area where I would have liked to see more in the report. There are a lot of regulations that keep people out of jobs. There are a lot of regulations that keep prices higher than they should be. And those regulations hurt poor people. And if we can get rid of some of those, then that would help child poverty as well.
Tim.
I share the comments of Dolores, at least, and most of Mike's. It's a difficult thing. My problem with the housing vouchers is that a local housing authority decides who gets the vouchers. Families and children get less than half the vouchers. There are a lot of disabled people and elderly people in line for those vouchers, so getting it through would be hard. What I like to think, and this is from my student Matt Desmond, who's wrote a lot about eviction, sometimes it's high cost of housing, sometimes it's low income. You can't afford to pay the rent. What happened in Milwaukee wasn't about the high price of housing, it was about how low incomes are, particularly for minorities living in the middle of Milwaukee, where the Democrats are going next year, and you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, as they get closer. So by increasing income, by giving a child allowance, having something at the end of every month, hopefully you can avoid evictions, avoid the instability that comes with housing, which is being forcibly moved somewhere, which is the real problem. So there are ways to get at the housing issue, I think, through stabilizing income and raising incomes, not just through increasing the supply, although I'm totally in favor of increasing the supply of affordable housing. We're doing that, trying to do a lot of it in Madison, but it's a huge job.
Next question, right here.
despite the, I'm Quentin Wilson, I'm working at George Washington University. Despite the limitation or charge of the study project that you had to reduce poverty by 50% in 520 weeks, I wonder if, I'm kind of guessing that you all had some ideas or brought up other ideas that if you didn't have that restriction, you might have considered more effective. I wondered if any of you or all of you would like to talk about some of the things you'd like to have seen if Congress hadn't restricted your charter.
Well, there's any number of intergenerational programs, early education, parenting programs, improvements in K-12 schooling, for example. We need a separate report to review those things, right? Because there are a lot of ideas, there's a lot of evidence, and some of them seem promising to reduce poverty in the next generation, but it was not part of our task, but it's a very important task for someone to take on.
I would just add really briefly that improvements in health are also hugely important and very likely to have long-term implications. We couldn't consider them.
Bill, we got a microphone to go over there. Bill, look the other way. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, just got to be quick.
Well, I don't know about that.
You
First,
better change your mind
Ask
then.
a long question in this building if anybody has.
if
Bill.
you're running out of time, Ron, I don't need to say anything at all.
Okay, well, we've got a couple of minutes, so.
Okay. First of all, congratulations to all of you. It was a great job. Well done. Just a couple of comments quickly. First of all, I think the point that I think Michael already made, that when you don't have evidence that something works, that's not sufficient to say that it doesn't work. It's just sufficient to say we don't know enough yet. You know, we're having this debate around the Mueller report, and I'd hate to compare your report to the Mueller report, but it's a similar kind of issue about evidence. A null finding is not the same thing as being able to say this would not do the trick. The second thing I want to say is on the marriage and fertility issues. I'm glad you brought those up, Ron, and I'm glad the report brought them up. I think that's really important. There's a big difference between them. One is that we do know, I think, about some of the family planning initiatives. They do have an effect, and we have randomized studies about that. The link we don't know is from the drop in the effects of the programs and the long-term effect on poverty. In the marriage case, we don't even have evidence about the programs themselves, about how to change the behavior. So that's a very different, those are two different stories. The other thing is I would really caution us about using the phrase controlling fertility. It's all wrong. Right now, society is controlling women's fertility by not giving them access to effective and affordable means to do exactly what they want to do, which is to have children when they want to. And so let's be very clear about that. We're trying to empower women here. We're not trying to control them. A lot of people would argue, myself included, society should make it possible for women to choose when and if to have a baby. So I just want to caution about that phraseology.
Okay, so we're out of time, and please join me in thanking the members of the panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.